Eleanor, the East Wing bathrooms need attention again. Those children have made an absolute disaster of them, Victoria Blackwood called out without looking up from her fashion magazine. Her manicured fingers flipped another glossy page as she reclined on the antique chaise lounge that had been in Thornfield Manor for over a century. I nodded silently, my hands already raw from the morning's work polishing the grand staircase banisters. "Yes, Mrs. Blackwood," I replied, my voice soft, but steady. At 62, I had perfected the art of invisibility in this house, seen only when needed, heard only when addressed. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you, and do something about those hedges along the garden path. They're beginning to look absolutely feral. The Montgomery Smiths are coming for dinner on Friday, and I won't have them thinking we've let the place go to ruin, Victoria added, her gaze never leaving the magazine. I gathered my cleaning supplies, watching as Victoria's youngest daughter, Amelia, traipsed through the hallway, trailing mud from the garden across the marble floors I had spent 3 hours polishing that morning. She didn't even glance my way as she called out to her mother about some urgent social catastrophe involving her Instagram followers. Such was life at Thornfield Manor, where I had served the Blackwood family for 30 years. To them, I was simply Eleanor the maid, the gray-haired woman who appeared with fresh towels and disappeared with dirty dishes, who cleaned their messes and kept their secrets, who weathered their moods and memorized their preferences. None of them knew that beneath my worn uniform and calloused hands lay the truth that would shatter their privileged world. I, Eleanor Parker, was the rightful owner of Thornfield Manor and every precious antique, every acre of manicured garden, and every pound in the trust that maintained it. As I scrubbed the marble bathroom floors on my hands and knees, I allowed myself a small smile. 30 years of patience was about to bear fruit. In just 3 days, everything would change. The timer on my carefully orchestrated plan was nearly at 0. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, like this video, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. My thoughts drifted back to that rainy afternoon in 1990 when my father, Augustus Parker, had called me into his study. I was 32 then, unmarried and dedicated to my academic career in art history. "Eleanor, my dear," he had said, his voice weakened by illness, "I've made arrangements for Thornfield. You are my only child, and everything will come to you. Upon my passing." I remembered my confusion. "But father, what about Cousin Richard and his family? They've been living in the East Wing for years." My father's face had darkened. "Richard is distant family by marriage only, and he has been siphoning money from the estate for years. I've discovered his embezzlement, but confronting him would create a scandal that would tarnish the Parker name. I have a different plan." That plan had been as brilliant as it was patient. My father had created a trust to manage Thornfield, with me as the true beneficiary, but officially listed only as a household employee. A clause stipulated that the truth could not be revealed for 30 years. During that time, Richard and his descendants could live at Thornfield under the illusion that they had inherited it, but they could not sell it or access the principal of the trust, only the interest, which was substantial enough to maintain both the estate and their lavish lifestyle. "Why 30 years, Father?" I had asked. "Because by then, the statute of limitations on Richard's financial crimes will have expired, so there can be no prosecution. And because you, my dear daughter, will have had the opportunity to observe their true characters without the mask of pretense, you will know exactly who deserves compassion and who does not when the time comes to reclaim what is yours." My father had died a week later. At the reading of the will, Richard Blackwood, who had changed his name to distance himself from his own modest beginnings, had been smugly triumphant, barely containing his glee as the solicitor announced that he had inherited Thornfield Manor. I had sat quietly in the corner, the newly appointed housekeeper retained as part of the estate's staff, watching as Richard's wife Victoria had immediately begun planning renovations to that dreadfully outdated study. Richard had offered me a small cottage on the property, seemingly as a kindness to his cousin's loyal employee. "After all, Eleanor, you've nowhere else to go, and we could use someone who knows the old place's quirks." I had accepted with appropriate gratitude, knowing that the cottage had been my mother's painting studio and rightfully mine anyway. That night, I had burned my academic credentials, donated my professional wardrobe, and stepped fully into the role that would be my disguise for 3 decades. Now, Richard was 7 years in his grave, taken by the same heart condition that had claimed my father. Victoria had assumed control of the household with her 3 children: Charles, the eldest at 41, and a failed businessman who had returned to the family home after his 3rd divorce; Margaret, 38, who had married wealth and visited, only to criticize everything from my cooking to the way I folded her cashmere sweaters; and Amelia, the youngest at 35, who had never worked a day in her life and treated Thornfield as her personal playground and Instagram backdrop. None of them had ever suspected that the quiet woman who washed their clothes and prepared their meals, held a doctorate in art history, spoke 4 languages, and could identify every priceless artwork and antique in the manner that they took for granted. None of them knew that I carefully documented every slight, every cruelty, and every instance of neglect toward the estate my family had built over generations. "Eleanor! Eleanor! Where are you?" Victoria's voice echoed through the hallway. I set aside my cleaning cloth and hurried to the drawing room. "Yes, Mrs. Blackwood?" Victoria was standing by the fireplace, holding a delicate porcelain figurine from the Ming Dynasty that was worth more than most people's annual salary. "This has a chip in it. Did you drop it while dusting?" I knew the chip had been caused by Amelia's carelessness the previous week when she had knocked it over while taking selfies. I had seen it happen from the doorway but had remained silent. "I apologize, Mrs. Blackwood. It may have happened during cleaning," I said, lowering my eyes in practiced deference. "Really, Eleanor, these pieces are irreplaceable. They've been in the Blackwood family for generations," Victoria scolded, unaware of the irony in her statement. The figurine, like everything else in the house, had been in the Parker family, my family, for generations before the Blackwoods had ever set foot in Thornfield. "It won't happen again," I murmured. "See that it doesn't. And Charles is bringing a business associate for lunch tomorrow. Prepare that salmon dish he likes and make sure the dining room is immaculate." I nodded and retreated to the kitchen, where I began preparing dinner. Through the window, I could see Charles lounging by the pool, nursing his 4th scotch of the day while supposedly working remotely for a company that existed primarily on paper. His position had been secured through the Blackwood name and connections, though the family fortune was actually the Parker fortune, my fortune. As I chopped vegetables for the evening meal, my phone vibrated in my pocket. Few people had this number. I had deliberately cultivated a small social circle to maintain my cover, but I knew who this would be. "Is everything in order for Friday?" asked the crisp voice of Helena Wright, the solicitor who had replaced her father as the keeper of my family's legal affairs. "Yes," I replied quietly, moving to the pantry where I wouldn't be overheard. "The Blackwoods will all be present for dinner. They're entertaining the Montgomery Smiths." "And they still have no idea?" "None whatsoever. Victoria is currently planning a renovation of the East Wing. She's been discussing contractors." Helena chuckled. "How ambitious of her, considering she won't have any authority over the property in 3 days. Has the trust paperwork been updated as I requested?" "Yes, all the documents are ready. The court has confirmed the appointment for 3 p.m. on Friday. Once the judge validates the trust documents and your identity, you'll officially be recognized as the sole owner of Thornfield Manor and all associated properties and accounts." I closed my eyes, allowing myself a moment to envision the scene that would unfold at Friday's dinner. And the provisions for the staff? All arranged. The long-term employees will receive the generous packages you specified. Your father would. Be proud, Eleanor. You've honored his wishes to the letter. I thanked her and ended the call, tucking the phone away just as Amelia burst into the kitchen. Eleanor, have you seen my blue Louboutins? The ones with the crystals on the heels? I believe they're in your dressing room, Miss Amelia. The second shelf on the right. She rolled her eyes. I already looked there. God, what do we even pay? You four? Just find them before Friday. I need them for the dinner. As she flounced out, I returned to my cooking, adding a pinch of herbs from the garden I had tended for decades. These herbs grew from cuttings that my mother had planted, in soil that had belonged to my family since 1783. Every inch of this estate was intertwined with Parker history, not Blackwood pretensions. That evening, as the family dined on the meal I had prepared, I ate my portion alone in the kitchen, as I had done every night for 30 years. Through the serving hatch, I could hear their conversation. The Montgomery Smiths just returned from Monaco, Victoria was saying. Apparently they dined with actual royalty. Speaking of royalty, Charles slurred, already deep into the wine cellar's best offerings. Did I tell you about the prince I met at the club last month? He's interested in my investment opportunity, Margaret snorted. Charles, the last prince you met turned out to be a con artist from Leeds. This is different. He has connections to Saudi oil money. Like that cryptocurrency venture you lost. 100,000 on, Amelia laughed. Face it, brother dear, you're a terrible businessman. At least I've had a job. Charles snapped back. Their bickering continued as I cleared their half-eaten meals. Meals they barely appreciated despite my culinary training in France during my vacations over the years. These skills, like my education, had been maintained. In secret, funded by a separate account my father had established for me that the Blackwoods knew nothing about. Later that night, after the family had retired, I slipped into the study that had once been my father's sanctuary. Now it was Charles's domain, though he used it primarily for drinking and online gambling rather than managing the estate as my father had done. I unlocked the hidden compartment behind the bookshelf, a secret Charles had never discovered despite living in the house his entire life, and retrieved the original deed to Thornfield Manor. The yellowed document clearly stated the property belonged to the Parker family. Along with it were the trust documents my father had created, the codicil that established the 30-year waiting period, and my own birth certificate and identification papers. For 3 decades, I had been the silent observer of the Blackwoods' lives. I had witnessed Charles's failed marriages and business ventures, always cushioned by the trust's money. I had watched Margaret marry into another wealthy family and return only to remind everyone of her superior taste and status. I had seen Amelia grow from a spoiled child into a spoiled adult, contributing nothing to society beyond Instagram posts about luxury and privilege. I had also watched Victoria's calculated social climbing, her fair-weather friendships, and her casual cruelty to those she deemed beneath her, which included me and the rest of the staff. After Richard's death, she had fired half the long-term employees to cut costs, only to spend twice as much on redecorating the conservatory. None of them had ever shown any real appreciation for Thornfield itself, its history, its architectural significance, the generations of care that had gone into creating and maintaining such a place. To them, it was merely a status symbol and a source of income through the trust. I returned the documents to their hiding place and made my way to my cottage at the edge of the property. Unlike the main house, which the Blackwoods had redecorated, repeatedly according to passing trends, my small residence remained a sanctuary of authenticity. The furnishings were modest, but genuine antiques. The walls displayed small watercolors painted by my mother, works that the Blackwoods had deemed amateurish and consigned to storage, not recognizing their artistic merit or sentimental value. As I prepared for bed, I reviewed my plans for the remaining 3 days. Everything was in place. The catering for Friday's dinner had been arranged, a show of hospitality that would make the evening's revelations all the more dramatic. The security team that would escort the Blackwoods from the premises if necessary had been briefed. Helena would arrive with the official documents and a court representative to witness the transfer of ownership. For 30 years, I had cleaned their messes, endured their disrespect, and maintained the legacy they thought was theirs. For 30 years, I had watched them squander opportunities and resources while believing themselves entitled to the fruits of my family's labors. In 3 days, Eleanor the Invisible Maid would become Eleanor Parker, rightful owner of Thornfield Manor. In 3 days, the masks would fall, and truth would finally be served alongside the Montgomery Smiths' dinner. I closed my eyes, a small smile playing at my lips. Patience had always been my virtue. 30 years was a long game, but as my father used to say, true justice is worth the wait. Outside my window, Thornfield Manor stood silhouetted against the night sky, its grand facade hiding centuries of history and secrets. Soon, very soon, it would be truly mine again. The morning light filtered through the cottage windows as I reviewed my checklist for the upcoming dinner. 2 days remained before the revelation that would change everything at Thornfield Manor. I sipped my Earl Grey tea, a small luxury I allowed myself each morning before donning the invisible cloak of servitude. My phone chimed with a message from Helena. Court documents processed. Judge Hamilton confirmed for Friday verification. Are you having second thoughts? I smiled at her concern. After 30 years of careful planning, hesitation wasn't in my vocabulary. No second thoughts, I replied. Only anticipation. The cottage door opened onto a misty garden. I paused to inhale the scent of roses, the heritage varieties my mother had cultivated decades ago, which I had quietly maintained despite Victoria's attempts to replace them with showier modern hybrids. These roses, like me, had endured through patient resilience. As I made my way toward the main house, I spotted Charles stumbling across the lawn in last night's clothes. Another late evening at the local pub, no doubt, where he pretended to be negotiating important business deals while actually drinking away trust fund money and chasing women half his age. "Morning, Eleanor," he called out with the false cheer he reserved for staff when he was feeling guilty about something. "Lovely day, isn't it?" "Indeed, Mr. Charles," I replied, keeping my eyes appropriately downcast. "Shall I prepare your hangover remedy?" His smile faltered. "That would be, yes, thank you." In the kitchen, I mixed the concoction I'd been making. For him since he was 23, fresh lemon juice, ginger, honey, and a pinch of cayenne pepper. The irony wasn't lost on me that I had spent decades nurturing the very people who had taken everything from me, right down to providing comfort for the consequences of their self-indulgence. Victoria swept into the kitchen as I was finishing, already dressed in designer casual wear despite the early hour. "Eleanor, we need to discuss the dinner menu for Friday. The Montgomery Smiths are bringing their son Sebastian this time. He's just returned from some charity work in Africa or India or somewhere equally dreadful." She waved her hand dismissively. "Amelia seems quite taken with him, so everything must be perfect." I nodded, mentally cataloging the additional guest. Sebastian Montgomery Smith, the only son of the family, who had indeed been doing humanitarian work in Tanzania for the past 3 years. Unlike the others who would be at the dinner, Sebastian had a reputation for genuine compassion and social consciousness. I had researched all potential dinner guests thoroughly. "I thought perhaps the spring lamb with rosemary and lavender honey," I suggested, "and the asparagus from the kitchen garden is at its peak." Victoria seemed surprised by my input but nodded. "Yes, that sounds suitable. And for dessert?" "The elderflower panna cotta with the champagne sabayon. It was well received at Christmas." Fine. Just make sure everything is immaculate. The Montgomery Smiths' approval could be vital for Amelia's future prospects." She turned to leave, then paused. "Oh, and Eleanor, do wear your good uniform on Friday. The black one with the proper collar. not that shabby gray thing. Yes, Mrs. Blackwood, I replied, though I had no intention of dressing as a servant for Friday's dinner. The charcoal silk dress hanging in my cottage wardrobe, understated but impeccably tailored in Paris, would make its debut instead. After Victoria left, I began preparing the day's meals while mentally walking through the manor's spaces. Each room held memories, some from my childhood before the Blackwoods, others accumulated during my years of silent observation. The drawing room where my mother had taught me to play chess on rainy afternoons, now cluttered with Victoria's tacky, decorative objects. The library where my father had read me Shakespeare, its first editions now gathering dust because none of the Blackwoods appreciated literature beyond glossy magazines. Margaret arrived at 11, sweeping in with a cloud of expensive perfume and demands. She lived just 20 minutes away in an equally grand estate, acquired through her marriage to Jonathan Winters, a banking executive whose family wealth nearly matched what she believed was her own inheritance. Eleanor, where is Mother? We have the charity luncheon at 1 and she's not answering her phone. Margaret dropped her designer handbag on the kitchen counter, directly on top of the vegetables I was chopping. I gently moved her bag aside. Mrs. Blackwood is in the conservatory, with her garden club Miss Margaret. Margaret sighed dramatically. Of course she is. Those dreary women and their obsession with orchids. She glanced around the kitchen with a critical eye. This place really is becoming terribly outdated. Jonathan's mother just had her entire kitchen redone with Italian marble and state-of-the-art appliances. I bit back the response that Thornfield's kitchen featured handcrafted English oak cabinetry and heritage tiles that predated the Blackwoods by a century. Instead, I murmured, "How lovely for her." Mother should consider a complete renovation. The Montgomery Smith's house has been featured in Architectural Digest twice. Margaret helped herself to a strawberry from the basket I'd just washed. Are those people still coming for dinner on Friday? Mother's been in a state about it all week. Yes, Miss Margaret. Will you be joining the party? Obviously. Jonathan, too. We wouldn't miss it. A calculating look crossed her face. Sebastian. Montgomery Smith is quite the catch. Old money, good schools, and apparently quite handsome despite that ridiculous charity work. Mother's determined to secure him for Amelia, though God knows that girl has nothing to offer beyond her trust fund. If only Margaret knew how precarious that trust fund actually was. By Friday evening, the financial reality of the Blackwood family would be dramatically different. I'm sure Miss Amelia has many fine qualities, I said neutrally, returning to my vegetable preparation. Margaret snorted. Like selfishness and an inability to function in the real world? Eleanor, you've been here forever. You know exactly what a spoiled brat my sister is. She leaned against the counter. Actually, I've been meaning to ask you something. How much do they pay you these days? The question took me by surprise. In 30 years, none of the Blackwoods had ever shown the slightest interest in my compensation. Enough for my needs, Miss Margaret. Would you consider coming to work for us instead? Jonathan's mother claims our staff is stealing from her, so we're replacing them. You're honest, at least. I allowed myself a small smile at the irony. I'm flattered by the offer. Miss Margaret, but my place is here at Thornfield. I'd pay you 20% more than whatever Mother gives you. If only she knew that by Friday evening my net worth would eclipse her husband's several times over. That's very generous, but I must decline. Margaret looked genuinely puzzled, unable to comprehend loyalty that wasn't tied to financial gain. Before she could press further, Victoria entered the kitchen, dressed for her charity luncheon in a peach-colored suit that did nothing for her complexion. There you are, Margaret. We're going to be late. The silent auction items need to be arranged before the guests arrive. She turned to me. Eleanor, we'll be back around 4. Make sure Charles actually gets dressed today, and remind Amelia about her dress fitting at 3. After they left, I continued with my work, moving through the manor with practiced efficiency. In the library, I paused to check on a particular volume, a first edition of Jane Eyre that had belonged to my grandmother. Victoria had once considered selling it, unaware of its true value, both monetary and sentimental. I had quietly removed it from the for appraisal pile and returned it to the shelves, where it remained unnoticed for years. I ran my fingers along its spine, remembering how my grandmother had read it to me, relating the story of the overlooked governess who eventually claimed her rightful place. The parallel wasn't lost on me, though unlike Jane, I hadn't needed a dramatic fire to bring about justice, only patience and careful planning. The afternoon passed in a blur of household duties. I delivered Charles's lunch to the pool house, where he was allegedly working on a prospectus, but actually watching sports on his tablet. I reminded Amelia about her dress fitting, enduring her complaints about how utterly boring the Montgomery Smiths were, except for Sebastian, who was kind of hot in that do-gooder way. By evening, I retreated to my cottage to review the final details with Helena, who called precisely at 8:30 as arranged. "The court representative will arrive with me at 2:30 on Friday," she explained. "We'll verify the documents and your identity before proceeding to the manor for dinner." "And the security team?" "On standby from 7 p.m. They'll remain out of sight unless needed. The locksmith is also prepared to change all the entry codes immediately following the announcement." I considered the potential reactions from each Blackwood. Charles would bluster and threaten legal action. Margaret would calculate angles for financial advantage. Victoria would oscillate between denial and attempts at social damage control. Amelia would likely dissolve into dramatic tears. "What about the staff?" Helena asked. "Are they prepared for the change in management?" "Most of them have no idea," I admitted. "Only Mrs. Winters, the cook, knows the truth. She's been with the family since before the Blackwoods and was my mother's friend. The others will receive generous severance packages if they choose not to stay on under the new arrangements." Helena was silent for a moment. "Eleanor, I've been handling the legal side of this for years, but I've never asked, what made you agree to your father's plan? 30 years is a long time to live as someone you're not." I moved to the window, looking out at Thornfield Manor silhouetted against the evening sky. At first, it was grief and filial duty. My father asked this of me on his deathbed, and I couldn't refuse. Then it became a matter of justice, seeing firsthand how the Blackwoods treated both the estate and the people who maintained it. "But you gave up your career, your identity." I transformed them. My academic research continued in secret. The articles I've published under a pseudonym over the years have influenced art history scholarship more than they would have if I'd remained in academia. I smiled, thinking of the leather-bound journals that contained 3 decades of my observations and analyses. As for my identity, I never lost it. I simply concealed it beneath a role that gave me perfect cover to observe the true nature of the people who believed they owned my heritage. The next day, my final full day as Eleanor the maid, dawned bright and clear. The manor hummed with preparation for Friday's dinner. I supervised the delivery of fresh flowers, directed the cleaning of the formal dining room's chandelier, and prepared shopping lists for the elaborate meal to come. Victoria fussed over every detail, desperate to impress the Montgomery Smiths, especially for Amelia's sake. "Eleanor, make sure the good silver is properly polished, and use the Wedgwood with the gold trim, not the everyday china." "Yes, Mrs. Blackwood," I replied, though I had already planned to use the hand-painted Sèvres porcelain that had been commissioned by my great-great-grandfather in 1850, pieces so valuable that Victoria kept them locked in the butler's pantry, considering them too fussy for regular use. At noon, an unexpected visitor arrived. Through the kitchen window, I watched a sleek black Audi pull up the driveway. The man who emerged was tall and distinguished, with salt-and-pepper hair and the confident bearing of someone accustomed to authority. Sebastian Montgomery Smith had arrived a day early. Charles intercepted him at the front entrance. "Sebastian, didn't expect you until tomorrow. Parents not with you?" "They're coming tomorrow as planned," Sebastian replied, his voice carrying, to where I stood near an open window. "I hope to speak with you about the conservation project before the formal dinner. My foundation has some questions about the land survey." I froze at these words. The conservation project could only refer to the nature preserve that Charles had been hinting about establishing on Thornfield's grounds, a project I knew was actually a thinly veiled plan to develop luxury housing while claiming tax benefits for a minimal conservation area. "Ah, yes, that," Charles said, his voice taking on the forced joviality that signaled his discomfort. Come in. We can discuss it over drinks." I adjusted my schedule to ensure I would be serving their refreshments personally. This conversation was too important to miss, especially coming just one day before my revelation. In the study, I arranged a tray with the specialty whiskey Charles reserved for important guests. Sebastian Montgomery Smith was even more impressive up close. Intelligent eyes that missed nothing, an air of genuine authority rather than Charles's affected importance. "Thank you," Sebastian said, actually looking at me as I served the drinks, a rarity among the Blackwood's guests. "The site surveys indicate that the proposed development would seriously impact 3 protected species," Sebastian continued once I had left the room. I lingered in the hallway, ostensibly dusting the antique side table while listening. My foundation can't support a project that would cause such environmental damage. Charles's voice took on a wheedling quality I recognized from his failed business pitches. "The housing development is a minor part of the overall conservation plan. Think of the potential benefits to the community." "I've reviewed the plans, Charles. The conservation area is barely 15% of the total acreage, while the luxury housing would cover the most ecologically significant portions of the land." I smiled to myself. Sebastian Montgomery Smith was not going to be easily manipulated. Fact that would make tomorrow's dinner even more interesting. Their conversation continued, with Charles making increasingly desperate attempts to salvage his development scheme, and Sebastian firmly but politely dismantling each argument. Eventually, Amelia's voice interrupted them as she burst into the study, clearly having been alerted to Sebastian's early arrival. "Sebastian! What a lovely surprise!" she exclaimed with feigned astonishment. Her hair and makeup were too perfect for someone who had supposedly just happened to wander into the study. I took the opportunity to slip away, my mind racing with this new development. Charles had been planning to announce the conservation project at tomorrow's dinner, presenting it as a philanthropic collaboration with the Montgomery Smiths Foundation. Now that facade was crumbling before the main event had even begun. That evening, as I prepared for my final night as a servant of Thornfield Manor, I laid out 2 outfits side by side on my bed. The worn uniform I had donned for 3 decades, and the elegant charcoal silk dress I would wear tomorrow as Eleanor Parker, rightful owner of the estate. My phone chimed with a final message from Helena. "All systems go for tomorrow. Sleep well. Justice comes at last." I smiled, folding the uniform away for the final time. Tomorrow, the Blackwoods would learn that the woman they had ordered about, overlooked and underestimated for 30 years, held their fate in her calloused hands. Tomorrow, Thornfield Manor would return to the family that had built it, loved it, and maintained its legacy through generations. Tomorrow, the maid would become the mistress, and 3 decades of patience would finally bear fruit. Friday morning arrived with golden autumn sunshine streaming through my cottage windows. I allowed myself the luxury of sleeping until 7, 1 hour later than my usual rising time for the past 3 decades. Today, everything would change. Today, the carefully maintained facade would finally crumble. I savored my morning tea, a rare sense of anticipation replacing the resigned discipline that had governed my days for so long. My phone chimed with a message from Helena. "Court appointment confirmed for 2:30. Everything in place. Are you ready?" Was I ready? This question had countless layers. Was I ready to reclaim my birthright after 30 years of patient waiting? Was I ready to face the shock, outrage, and inevitable backlash from the Blackwoods? Was I ready to step back into the life I had set aside when I was 32 years old? Ready, I replied simply. At precisely 8:15, I entered the Manor's kitchen through the staff entrance for the last time. Mrs. Winters, the elderly cook who had known me since childhood and was the only current staff member aware of my true identity, gave me a knowing smile as I tied on my apron. "Big day today, Miss Eleanor," she murmured, her arthritic hands expertly kneading dough for the evening's dinner rolls. "Indeed, Mrs. Winters," I replied quietly. "Are you certain you wish to stay on afterward? Your retirement cottage is prepared regardless." She patted my hand with floury fingers. "And miss seeing their faces? Not for all the tea and china, love. Besides, I promised your mother I'd look after you, and that promise doesn't end today." The morning passed in a flurry of final preparations. I supervised the delivery of fresh flowers for the dining room centerpieces, confirmed the wine selections with the cellar master, and reviewed the table settings with the housemaids. To all appearances, I was simply ensuring the Blackwoods' important dinner would meet their exacting standards. At 10 o'clock, Victoria summoned me to the drawing room, where she was frantically rearranging decorative objects on the mantelpiece. "Eleanor, the florist has completely misunderstood my instructions. These arrangements are all wrong, too rustic for an evening with the Montgomery Smiths." She gestured at the elegant compositions of seasonal blooms and foliage that I had actually specified myself, knowing they would complement the dining room's antique wallpaper. "Can they be redone by this evening?" "I'll speak with them immediately," I said calmly. "Perhaps adding some of the white orchids from the conservatory would elevate the arrangements." Victoria paused, looking at me with mild surprise. In 3 decades, she had never grown accustomed to my occasional suggestions despite their invariable success. "Yes, that might work. See to it." As I turned to leave, she added, "And Eleanor, has Sebastian Montgomery Smith been comfortable in the blue guest suite? Charles mentioned he arrived yesterday." "Yes, Mrs. Blackwood. He specifically praised the first edition Dickens collection in the bookcase. I provided him with breakfast on the terrace at 7, as he requested." She frowned. 7? That's absurdly early. And why wasn't I informed he takes breakfast so early? "Because you've never risen before 9 in 30 years, I thought. I believe Mr. Charles was aware. Mr. Sebastian mentioned they had discussed an early start to visit the estate grounds. The estate grounds? Victoria's alarm was palpable. "What on earth for?" "I believe it relates to the conservation project Mr. Charles has proposed," I replied, knowing this would send her into a tailspin of anxiety. Victoria had not been fully briefed on Charles's development scheme, which would potentially transform a significant portion of Thornfield's historic grounds into luxury housing. "Conservation project? What conservation project?" Her voice rose, sharply. "Charles! Charles!" I slipped away as Charles was summoned from the pool house, where he had been nursing another hangover. The discord I had intentionally sown would keep the Blackwoods distracted throughout the day, reducing the likelihood that they would notice anything unusual in my activities. At 11, I encountered Sebastian Montgomery Smith in the library, where he was examining a volume of botanical illustrations that had belonged to my mother. "Extraordinary collection," he remarked as I entered to dust the shelves, an unnecessary task I was performing solely to observe him. "These redoute rose prints are museum quality." "The late Mrs. Parker was quite the botanist," I replied, deliberately, using my mother's name rather than referring to her as the old Mrs. Blackwood, as Victoria preferred. Sebastian looked up with interest. "Parker? I thought the family name was Blackwood." "The Parkers were the original owners of Thornfield," I explained, allowing myself this small preview of the evening's revelations. "The estate changed hands some years ago." "Interesting." "The land survey documentation still references Parker Holdings in some sections." He closed the book carefully. "You seem to know a great deal about the estate's history." I've been employed here for many years, sir. How many years, if you don't mind my asking? I met his gaze steadily. 30 years this October, Mr. Montgomery Smith, he nodded thoughtfully. Then you would have known the estate during the transition period. I'd be interested to hear your perspective on how the land has been managed over time. My foundation is particularly concerned with preserving both cultural and natural heritage. Perhaps we could discuss it this evening, I suggested. I believe you'll find tonight's dinner most illuminating on several fronts. A flicker of curiosity crossed his face, but before he could pursue the conversation, Amelia burst into the library, dressed in riding clothes despite having never mastered anything beyond the most basic equestrian skills. Sebastian, there you are. Mother said you might like a tour of the stables. Daddy bred racehorses, you know, before he passed. This was a blatant fabrication. Richard Blackwood had purchased exactly 2 racehorses in his lifetime, both failures on the track, and had sold them within a year. That sounds interesting, Sebastian replied diplomatically. Though I was just having a fascinating conversation with— I'm sorry, I don't believe I caught your name? Eleanor, sir, just Eleanor. I lowered my eyes appropriately, resuming my dusting. Eleanor has been with us forever, Amelia said dismissively. She's practically part of the furniture. Come, the stables are gorgeous in this light. Perfect for my Instagram. As they departed, Sebastian cast a curious glance back at me. One? That suggested he sensed something beneath the surface of our brief exchange. I returned to my preparations, a small smile playing at my lips. The Montgomery Smith air was observant, an unexpected but welcome complication to the evening's drama. At precisely 1:45, I informed Victoria that I needed to collect some special ingredients from the village for the evening's dessert. This was my prearranged excuse to slip away for the court appointment that would legally reinstate me as Eleanor Parker, rightful owner of Thornfield Manor. Be quick about it, Victoria replied absently, distracted by her argument with Charles about the mysterious conservation project and its potential impact on the property she believed was hers. I drove my modest Ford Fiesta, the only personal extravagance I had allowed myself during my years of disguise, to the discreet solicitor's office in the village. Helena was waiting outside, immaculate in a charcoal pantsuit that complemented my own hidden attire. Ready for the performance of a lifetime? She asked as I approached. I've been performing for 30 years, I replied. Tonight is when I finally stop acting. Judge Hamilton was a stern-faced woman in her 60s who reviewed the trust documents with meticulous attention. These are most unusual arrangements, Ms. Parker, she commented, peering at me over her reading glasses. Your father created quite the elaborate legal strategy. He believed it was necessary to protect the estate and to allow me to observe the Blackwoods' true character without the mask of pretense they would certainly have worn had they known my identity. The judge nodded. The documentation is impeccable, and your identity verification matches all requirements. I hereby confirm the dissolution of the 30-year trust arrangement and recognize you, Eleanor Jane Parker, as the sole legal owner of Thornfield Manor and all associated properties and accounts, effective immediately. She stamped the final papers and handed them to Helena, who placed them in a leather portfolio. I imagine this evening will be quite memorable for the current occupants, the judge added with the faintest twitch of her lips. Indeed, Your Honor, I replied. Truth has been a long time coming to Thornfield. Back at my cottage, I finally shed the plain uniform I had worn for 3 decades. The transformation was more than clothing. It was the reclamation of identity. I stood before the mirror, a stranger to myself in some ways. The woman who gazed back was not the young academic who had set aside her life 30 years ago, but neither was she the invisible servant the Blackwoods had taken for granted. My silver hair was styled in a simple but elegant French twist, rather than the severe bun I normally wore. The charcoal silk dress draped perfectly across my shoulders, its subtle details speaking of quality rather than ostentation. A single strand of pearls, my mother's, kept hidden in my cottage all these years, completed the ensemble. Helena arrived. At 6:30, parking her sleek Mercedes at the cottage rather than the main house to maintain our element of surprise. She carried a slim briefcase containing the court documents and ownership papers. "The security team is in position," she informed me. "The catering staff has been briefed to follow only your instructions once the announcement is made." I nodded, feeling a curious calm. "And the Montgomery Smiths?" "Arrived 20 minutes ago. All 3 of them, plus Margaret and her husband. Charles and Amelia are already in the drawing room with them. Victoria is still upstairs changing her outfit for the 3rd time." I smiled at Helena's thoroughness. Like me, she had been planning this evening for years, though her involvement spanned a mere decade compared to my 30-year vigil. "Shall we?" I gestured toward the path that led from my cottage to the manor's side entrance, the route I had walked thousands of times as a servant, but would now take for the final time. The evening light cast long shadows across Thornfield's immaculate lawns as we approached. Through the tall windows, I could see the gathering in the drawing room. Charles gesticulating as he undoubtedly embellished some business anecdote, Amelia positioned strategically near Sebastian, the elder Montgomery Smiths nodding politely at whatever Margaret was saying. We entered through the garden door that led directly to the small antechamber adjacent to the drawing room. Mrs. Winters intercepted us, her eyes bright with anticipation. "They're all assembled, Miss Eleanor. Victoria just came down, wearing that ghastly peacock blue that does nothing for her complexion." She handed me a glass of water. "Steady now. 30 years is a long time to hold your peace." "Thank you, Mrs. Winters." I squeezed her wrinkled hand. "When dinner is announced, please ensure the Sèvres porcelain is used as I requested, not the Wedgwood that Victoria specified." She nodded with a conspirator's smile. "Already done, love. The table is set exactly as you instructed, just as your mother would have wanted it." Helena checked her watch. 7:25. Dinner was to be announced at 7:30. "Are you ready?" I took a deep breath, centering myself for the moment I had anticipated for 3 decades. "Yes, let's proceed." We positioned ourselves by the drawing room doors, waiting for the perfect moment. Inside, I could hear Victoria holding court. "The East Wing renovation will be featured in Country Life once it's completed," she was saying. "We're working with that marvelous designer who did the Rothschild estate. You must have seen it in last month's Architectural Digest," Charles interrupted, his voice slightly slurred from pre-dinner drinks. "Speaking of estates, Sebastian, I've been meaning to continue our discussion about the conservation initiative. I think you'll find our revised proposal addresses all your concerns." Sebastian's reply was measured. "I'd need to see significant changes to the development footprint before my foundation could consider endorsement." Amelia laughed too loudly. "Oh, Sebastian, you're so passionate about trees and frogs and things. It's adorable, really. Perhaps after dinner, we could walk in the moonlight and you could tell me all about your endangered species." The grandfather clock in the hall, a Parker family heirloom that predated the Blackwoods by centuries, began to chime the half-hour. This was the signal for dinner to be announced. Right on cue, Mrs. Winters appeared at the drawing room doorway. Normally this would be my role as housekeeper, but tonight the script had changed. "Dinner is served," she announced formally. Victoria frowned at this departure from protocol. "Where is Eleanor? She should be the one—" "I am here, Victoria," I said, stepping into the doorway with Helena beside me. The room fell silent. 8. Pairs of eyes turned toward me, expressions ranging from confusion to shock. "Eleanor?" Victoria finally managed. "What on earth are you wearing? And why are you calling me by my first name?" I smiled, savoring this first moment of many revelations to come. "Because as of 3:17 this afternoon, I am no longer your employee. In fact, I never truly was." Charles stood up unsteadily. "What is the meaning of this? And who is this woman with you? This is Helena Wright, my solicitor, I replied calmly. And the meaning is quite simple. I am Eleanor Parker, daughter of Augustus Parker, and the rightful owner of Thornfield Manor. The silence that followed was absolute. Victoria's face drained of color. Margaret froze with her champagne glass halfway to her lips. Charles stared in drunken confusion. Only Amelia seemed not to grasp the significance, her expression merely annoyed at the interruption to her flirtation with Sebastian. This is preposterous, Victoria finally spluttered. Richard inherited this estate. We have the documentation. You have what my father allowed you to believe was legal documentation, I corrected her. In reality, Richard was permitted to live here as part of a 30-year trust arrangement that expired today. Helena opened her briefcase and extracted the court papers. These documents, verified and sealed by Judge Hamilton this afternoon, confirm Ms. Parker's ownership of Thornfield Manor and all associated properties and accounts. Charles lurched forward. This is absurd. Some kind of con. Father owned this estate. Your father was a distant cousin by marriage who embezzled. From the Parker family trust, I stated flatly. My father discovered his theft, but chose to avoid scandal by creating a 30-year arrangement that would eventually restore the property to its rightful owners, while allowing me to observe the true character of those who believed they had inherited it. Victoria collapsed back onto the sofa, her face ashen. 30 years? You've been planning this for 30 years? While serving as our housekeeper? Yes, I confirmed. Every meal I've cooked, every floor I've scrubbed, every slight I've endured was part of fulfilling my father's final wish, to see Thornfield return to Parker hands, but only after I had witnessed for myself whether any of you deserved consideration. In the transition, Margaret stood up abruptly. This can't be legal. Jonathan, say something. She turned to her husband, who had remained conspicuously silent during the exchange. Jonathan Winters, a shrewd businessman despite his association with the Blackwoods, was already assessing the situation with calculating eyes. May I see the documentation? He asked Helena directly. She handed him the court papers. He scanned them quickly, his expression growing increasingly grave. These appear to be in order, he admitted reluctantly. But surely there must be some arrangement possible. The family has lived here for 30 years in good faith. Good faith? I echoed, allowing 3 decades of suppressed indignation to color my voice. Was it good faith when Victoria fired half the long-term staff who had served my family loyally for generations, just to fund her conservatory renovations? Was it good faith when Charles began planning to develop the protected woodlands into luxury housing? Was it good faith when all of you treated me, a woman you believed was merely your housekeeper, as if I were invisible, less than human? The Montgomery Smiths were watching this exchange with evident discomfort. Sebastian, however, seemed almost appreciative of the unfolding drama, his intelligent eyes moving between the players with keen interest. I think, he said carefully, that we should perhaps postpone our dinner engagement to allow the family to address these significant developments in private. On the contrary, Mr. Montgomery Smith, I replied. Dinner is served, and as the hostess of Thornfield Manor, I would be delighted if you would join me. The Blackwoods, however, have a choice to make. I turned to face the family who had dominated my life for 30 years. You may join us for dinner, during which we will discuss the terms of your departure from Thornfield, or you may begin packing. Immediately, security personnel are stationed at all exits to ensure that no family heirlooms, my family's heirlooms, leave the premises without authorization. Amelia finally grasped the situation, her face crumpling into the familiar prelude to the tears she had used to manipulate her parents since childhood. You can't just throw us out. Where are we supposed to go? This is our home. No, Amelia, I corrected her gently. This was never your home. It was my home, which your family occupied through deception. As for where you will go, That depends entirely on how you choose to behave in the coming hours. Victoria stood up shakily, her social training asserting itself even in catastrophe. We will, of course, join you for dinner. These matters can surely be discussed in a civilized manner. Charles was less composed. This is outrageous. I'll fight this all the way to the Supreme Court if necessary. You're welcome to try, Helena interjected smoothly. However, given your precarious financial situation, yes, we're aware of your failed investments and gambling debts. I would advise against incurring additional legal expenses, especially as your access to the trust funds will cease as of midnight. Tonight. This revelation hit the family like a physical blow. Without the trust income, they had nothing. No savings, no property, no means of maintaining their lavish lifestyle. Shall we proceed to dinner? I suggested calmly. Mrs. Winters has prepared a lovely meal, and it would be a shame to let it go to waste while we debate what is already legally settled. As the stunned party moved toward the dining room, Sebastian fell into step beside me. 30 years, he murmured. That is either remarkable patience or extraordinary stubbornness, Ms. Parker. Perhaps a bit of both, Mr. Montgomery Smith, I replied, along with a commitment to seeing justice done properly rather than hastily. He nodded thoughtfully. I suspect this dinner will be far more interesting than the one my parents anticipated when they accepted the Blackwoods' invitation. Indeed, I agreed, leading the way into the dining room where the table was set with the exquisite Sèvres porcelain that had been in my family for generations. I believe it will be a meal that none of us will soon forget. The Blackwoods followed in stunned silence, about to experience their first dinner at Thornfield Manor as guests rather than owners, the beginning of a transformation that had been 30 years in the making. The dining room of Thornfield Manor had witnessed countless meals over its long history, celebrations, negotiations, and confrontations spanning generations of the Parker family. Tonight, it would host perhaps its most extraordinary dinner yet, the moment when 30 years of deception would be fully unveiled. I took my place at the head of the table, the position that had belonged to my father and that Richard Blackwood had claimed without right. Victoria's face tightened as she realized she was expected to sit at my left rather than in her accustomed place of honor. Charles was positioned opposite his mother, while Margaret and her husband Jonathan were seated across from the elder Montgomery Smiths. Amelia found herself beside Sebastian, though her earlier flirtatious energy had evaporated entirely. Mrs. Winters personally served the first course, an elegant chilled soup featuring herbs from my mother's garden. The silence as we began was thick with tension and unasked questions. Perhaps, suggested Mr. Montgomery Smith, a distinguished man with the diplomatic bearing of someone accustomed to navigating difficult social situations, Ms. Parker might enlighten us as to how this unusual situation came about. I nodded, setting down my soup spoon. It began in 1990 when my father discovered that Richard Blackwood, who was a distant cousin by marriage, not a direct relation as he had led everyone to believe, had been systematically embezzling from the family trust for years. Charles's face flushed with anger. That's a lie. My father was a businessman of impeccable reputation. Your father, I continued calmly, altered financial records and diverted significant funds to offshore accounts. My father had ironclad evidence, but chose to avoid a public scandal that would have damaged the Parker family name. Instead, he devised a plan that would allow Richard and his family to maintain the appearance of legitimacy for a set period while ensuring the estate would eventually return to its rightful owner. But why would you agree to such an arrangement? Mrs. Montgomery Smith asked. 30 years as a servant in your own home? It seems an extraordinary sacrifice. I met her gaze steadily. My father asked it of me on his deathbed. Initially, I agreed out of love and respect for him. Later, as I observed how the Blackwoods treated both Thornfield and the people who maintained it, I became committed to seeing his plan through to completion. It became a matter of justice, not just inheritance. Victoria, who had been uncharacteristically silent, finally spoke. Are we genuinely expected to believe that you, our housekeeper, are actually some sort of dispossessed heiress? This is preposterous. Eleanor has never shown any sign of breeding or education. A small smile played at my lips. What signs were you looking for, Victoria? Perhaps a doctoral degree in art history, fluency in French, Italian, and German, an expert knowledge of antiques and fine art? I possess all of these, but you never bothered to see past the uniform. Sebastian leaned forward with evident interest. That explains your observations about the Redoute botanical prints earlier. You recognized their significance not just from working in the house, but from actual academic knowledge. Precisely, I acknowledged. Though I set aside my formal academic career, my education continued in private. I've published several well-regarded papers in art history journals under a pseudonym over the past 3 decades. Charles banged his fist on the table, causing the fine crystal to tremble. This is absurd. You expect us to simply accept that our entire lives have been some sort of experiment? That we don't own any of this? He gestured wildly at the dining room with its priceless artworks and antiques. Not an experiment, Mr. Blackwood, Helena interjected coolly. A legally binding trust arrangement that has now concluded according to its terms. The documentation has been verified by the court and is unassailable. Mrs. Winters entered with the main course. The spring lamb I had suggested to Victoria just yesterday, though now served on my family's Sèvres porcelain rather than the Wedgwood Victoria had specified. The old cook caught my eye and gave an almost imperceptible nod of approval as she set the platter before me. I still don't understand, Amelia said, her voice small and confused. If this is true, where will we go? What will we do? We don't have any money outside the trust. That, I replied, serving myself a portion of the lamb, depends on how we conclude our business this evening. I have prepared several options for your consideration. Margaret, always the most calculating of the siblings, straightened in her seat. What sort of options? Before we discuss that, I said, I'd like to hear from each of you. After 30 years of observing your true characters when you believed yourselves unobserved, I'm curious. What do you believe you deserve from this situation? The question hung in the air, a challenge that none of them seemed prepared to meet. Jonathan Winters, ever the pragmatist, was the first to speak. Clearly, if the legal documentation is as solid as it appears, the Blackwood family has no rightful claim to Thornfield itself. However, having lived here in good faith for 30 years, some form of transitional support would seem equitable. I nodded, neither agreeing nor disagreeing. Victoria, what are your thoughts? Victoria's hands trembled slightly as she reached for her wineglass. The proud woman who had ordered me about for decades was struggling to process this reversal of fortune. We have nowhere to go. This has been our home for 30 years. Surely some arrangement could be made for us to remain, perhaps in a portion of the estate. Remain? Charles exploded. Mother, are you mad? This woman has been lying to us. For decades, spying on us, judging us. And now we're supposed to negotiate for scraps? We should be suing her for fraud. There was no fraud, Helena corrected calmly. Every aspect of this arrangement was meticulously documented and legally executed. Ms. Parker simply did not volunteer information that she was under no obligation to disclose. Sebastian Montgomery Smith, who had been observing with evident fascination, addressed me directly. Ms. Parker, forgive my intrusion into what is clearly a family matter, but I'm curious. What did you hope to achieve through these 30 years of, shall we call it deep observation? Justice, I replied simply, and clarity. My father believed that character reveals itself over time when people believe themselves unobserved. He wanted me to make informed decisions about the future of Thornfield based on a complete understanding of the Blackwood's true nature. And what conclusions have you drawn? Sebastian asked. I took a measured sip of wine before responding. That depends on which Blackwood we're discussing. I turned my gaze to Charles. Charles has consistently demonstrated contempt for Thornfield itself. He has attempted to exploit the estate for personal gain through ill-conceived business ventures, including the current scheme to develop protected woodland into luxury housing while claiming tax benefits for minimal conservation efforts. Charles's face reddened, but before he could protest, I shifted my attention to Margaret. Margaret has visited Thornfield primarily to criticize, compare, and remind everyone of her superior status through her marriage. She has shown no genuine attachment to the estate or its heritage, seeing it merely as a status symbol and occasionally as a source of valuable items that might be borrowed for her own home. Margaret gasped. That's outrageous. I never— The Georgian silver candlesticks that disappeared after your Christmas visit in 2010, I interjected calmly. The small Monet sketch from the library in 2015. The antique pearl earrings from Victoria's jewelry box in 2018. Though those actually belonged to my mother, not to Victoria. Margaret fell silent, her face ashen. Jonathan stared at his wife with dawning comprehension. I continued, turning to Victoria. Victoria has treated Thornfield as a possession to be displayed rather than a heritage to be preserved. She replaced historical features with fashionable alternatives, dismissed long-serving staff who carried institutional knowledge of the estate's management, and consistently prioritized appearance over substance. Finally, I looked at Amelia. And Amelia has never shown any interest in Thornfield beyond its usefulness as a backdrop for social media. She has damaged historical artifacts, disturbed the gardens that my mother cultivated for decades, and treated the property and staff with consistent disregard. The silence that followed was profound. Even Charles seemed momentarily subdued by this clinical assessment of 30 years of observed behavior. So you see, I concluded, my decision about your future accommodations is informed by a lifetime of watching how each of you has valued or failed to value Thornfield itself. Mr. Montgomery Smith cleared his throat uncomfortably. Perhaps we should— No, please stay, I said. As potential conservation partners through Sebastian's foundation, the future stewardship of Thornfield's grounds concerns you directly. Sebastian nodded. I admit, I'm extremely interested in how Ms. Parker envisions the future of the estate, particularly given Charles's creative interpretation of conservation priorities in our previous discussions. Charles scowled but remained uncharacteristically silent. I signaled to Mrs. Winters, who brought in a selection of document folders, one for each Blackwood. These contain my proposed arrangements for each of you. I suggest you review them carefully before responding. Victoria opened her folder first, her hands visibly shaking. Her eyes widened as she scanned the contents. This is— You're offering me the dower house on the edge of the estate? With a stipend for maintenance? Yes, I confirmed. The dower house has historically been used for dowagers of the Parker family. It is substantially smaller than the manor but still comfortable, with 4 bedrooms and 2 acres of gardens. The stipend is conditional upon your agreeing to certain terms, including relinquishing all claims to Thornfield itself and returning any items you have removed from the main house over the years. Charles tore open his folder, then laughed bitterly. A rental allowance for 1 year and a recommendation letter for a position at a historical preservation society? This is insulting. It's considerably more than your business acumen or treatment of Thornfield's heritage would warrant, I replied coolly. You've repeatedly attempted to exploit the estate for short-term gain with no regard for its historical or ecological significance. The position would give you legitimate experience in heritage management, something you clearly need. Margaret was reading her document with increasing disbelief. Assistance in locating a suitable apartment and a one-time settlement of £50,000, contingent upon the return of all items borrowed from Thornfield over the years. This is hardly sufficient to maintain our standard of living. Your husband's income should adequately cover your lifestyle, Helena observed, though perhaps with fewer designer purchases than you've grown accustomed to. Jonathan Winters was reviewing his wife's documents with a grim expression. This list of items to be returned. Margaret, is this accurate? You took all of these things from Thornfield? Margaret's face flushed. They were family pieces. I was merely preserving them in our home. They were Parker family pieces, I corrected, not Blackwood possessions, and they were taken without permission, often with elaborate stories to explain their disappearance. The security cameras I had installed in 2005 documented most of these removals. Amelia was the last to open her folder. Her confusion was evident, as she read, University tuition and living expenses for a degree in historic landscape management? Why would I want that? Because, Amelia, I explained patiently, at 35, it's time you developed marketable skills and a genuine appreciation for heritage. Thornfield's gardens, designed by my mother and maintained by generations of dedicated gardeners, deserve better than to be trampled for Instagram backdrops. The program would give you both purpose and perspective. Amelia's lower lip trembled. But what about my lifestyle, my friends, my social media presence? All of which have been funded by the trust that no longer exists, Helena pointed out. Ms. Parker is offering you education and opportunity rather than merely cutting you off, which would be well within her rights. Victoria set down her folder with forced dignity. And if we refuse these generous offers? Then you leave Thornfield with nothing beyond your personal clothing and effects, I stated simply. The trust funds that have supported your lifestyle for 30 years reverted to me as of 3/17 this afternoon. The manor and all its contents are legally mine. You have no legal claim to any of it. Charles stood up abruptly, his face contorted with rage. This is extortion. You can't possibly expect us to just accept these insulting terms. Sit down, Charles, I said quietly. When he remained standing, I added, the security team outside has been instructed to escort out anyone who cannot maintain civil behavior during our discussion. I suggest you compose yourself. To everyone's surprise, it was Sebastian who spoke. Next. If I may offer an observation, the terms seem remarkably generous given the circumstances. Ms. Parker could legally require your immediate departure with nothing whatsoever. Instead, she's offering accommodation, financial support, and pathways to future security. Victoria stared at him in betrayal. You're taking her side? I'm not taking sides, Sebastian replied calmly. I'm merely pointing out that from a legal standpoint, you have no leverage in this negotiation. Ms. Parker is offering terms when she could simply evict you. Helena nodded. The security team is prepared to oversee your removal from the premises tonight if necessary. The terms Ms. Parker has offered include a 48-hour grace period for you to gather your personal belongings and vacate peacefully. Charles slumped back into his seat, the fight visibly draining from him as the reality of the situation finally penetrated. This can't be happening, he muttered. I assure you, it is, I replied, and it has been unfolding for 30 years, right beneath your noses. Every time you dismissed me as just the housekeeper, every time you left messes for me to clean without acknowledgement, every time you spoke about me as if I weren't in the room, you were digging your own graves in terms of any future consideration. Winters entered with dessert, the elderflower panna cotta that had been planned for the evening. The irony wasn't lost on me that I had suggested this menu to Victoria just yesterday, when she still believed herself to be the lady of the house. There is one additional element to consider, I continued as Mrs. Winters served the delicate desserts. My observations over 30 years have not been merely passive. I have documented every instance of mismanagement, every inappropriate use of trust funds, and every ethical lapse. Should you choose to contest my ownership legally, this documentation would become public record. Victoria paled. You wouldn't dare. The scandal would affect you as well. The Parker name has survived worse, I replied. And unlike you, I have nothing to hide. Richard's financial misdeeds may be beyond the statute of limitations, but Charles's recent attempts to develop protected land through shell companies, Margaret's systematic removal of valuable antiques, and your misappropriation of trust funds for personal expenses, Victoria, all of these would make fascinating reading for the society pages. The Montgomery Smiths exchanged uncomfortable glances. Perhaps, Mrs. Montgomery Smith suggested delicately, the families might benefit from some private discussion time. We could retire to the drawing room while these matters are considered. I nodded graciously. Of course, though I would be delighted if you would stay for coffee afterward. I believe Sebastian and I have a conservation initiative to discuss regarding Thornfield's grounds, one that actually preserves rather than exploits the natural heritage. Sebastian's eyes lit with interest. I would be very interested in hearing your vision for the estate, Ms. Parker. As the Montgomery Smiths excused themselves, the atmosphere in the dining room grew even more tense. The Blackwoods sat in stunned silence, the reality of their situation finally sinking in completely. Why? Victoria finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Why maintain this charade for 30 years? You could have challenged Richard's claim immediately after your father died. I considered her question carefully. Initially, because I promised my father. Later, because I wanted to understand if any of you might have redeeming qualities that would justify more generous treatment. And finally, because watching you all operate under the illusion of entitlement while I observed your true characters seemed a fitting response to Richard's years of deception toward my father. You enjoyed it, Charles accused bitterly. 30 years of watching us make fools of ourselves while you played the humble servant. Enjoyed is not the word I would choose, I replied. There was satisfaction in knowing the truth would eventually emerge, yes. But there was also genuine sadness in watching how poorly you stewarded my family's legacy, how little you appreciated the privilege you believed was your birthright. Margaret, ever practical, was already recalibrating to the new reality. The rye. Items you've listed, if we return them all, the financial settlement remains intact? Yes, Helena confirmed. Full compliance with all terms must be verified, but upon satisfaction, the arrangements outlined will be honored in full. And we have 48 hours? Victoria clarified, her social training automatically calculating what would need to be packed, what explanations would need to be crafted for friends and acquaintances. From this moment, I confirmed. Though the dower house would be available to you immediately, Victoria, should you wish to begin the transition tonight. It has been maintained in readiness. Amelia, who had been unusually quiet, finally spoke. Did you hate us all this time? While you were cooking our meals and cleaning our rooms? Were you hating us? The question caught me by surprise. It was perhaps the most insightful thing I had ever heard Amelia ask. I considered it carefully before responding. No, Amelia. I didn't hate you. I observed you. There's a significant difference. Hate would have colored my judgment and compromised my father's plan. What I felt was closer to disappointment, watching the potential for decency and appreciation that existed in each of you gradually erode under the influence of entitlement and false privilege. Charles laughed bitterly. How very magnanimous of you. Not magnanimous, I corrected. Strategic. Hatred would have revealed my hand too soon. Patience allowed me to see each of you clearly, in all circumstances over time. That clarity now informs my decisions about your futures. Victoria stood up slowly, decades of social training allowing her to maintain composure even in catastrophe. I would like to see the dower house tonight. If it is suitable, I may indeed prefer to begin the transition immediately rather than remain here under these changed circumstances. I nodded. Of course, Mrs. Winters will arrange for a car to take you there after coffee. The house is fully furnished and stocked with essentials. As the Blackwoods absorbed the finality of their situation, I felt a strange mixture of emotions. The vindication I had anticipated for 30 years was present, but so was an unexpected sense of closure. The charade was over. Thornfield was returned to Parker hands. Justice, long deferred, had finally arrived. "Shall we join the Montgomery Smiths for coffee?" I suggested, rising from my seat at the head of the table, the place that had always been rightfully mine. As we moved toward the drawing room, I caught Sebastian's curious gaze following me. In his eyes, I saw neither judgment nor pity, but something closer to admiration, perhaps for the patience and resolve that had allowed me to orchestrate this decades-long restoration of justice. The evening was far from over, but the hardest part was done. 30 years of silence had finally given way to truth, and Thornfield Manor would begin a new chapter, one where its rightful owner could finally speak her mind after decades of enforced invisibility. Coffee in the drawing room carried a strange formality. The Blackwoods sat in stunned silence, their world shattered beyond recognition. The Montgomery Smiths maintained polite conversation, their British upper-class training allowing them to navigate even this extraordinary social situation with outward composure. I served the coffee myself, not out of habit, but as a deliberate choice. For 3 decades, I had poured their drinks and anticipated their preferences. Tonight would be the final performance of that role, a symbolic transition from servant to mistress of Thornfield Manor. "One sugar? No cream for you, Mrs. Montgomery Smith?" I asked, though I knew the answer perfectly well. She accepted the cup with a gracious nod. "You have a remarkable memory, Ms. Parker." 30 years of observation tends to sharpen one's recall, I replied with a small smile. Victoria watched this exchange with visible discomfort, suddenly aware of how completely I knew their habits, preferences, and secrets. All the small intimacies that accumulate when someone is present but considered invisible. "I've arranged for a car to take you to view the Dower House," I informed Victoria. "It should be arriving shortly." "I'll accompany Mother," Charles announced, his earlier belligerence now tempered by the reality of their situation. Margaret leaned toward her husband. "We should return home and discuss these developments privately." Jonathan nodded, his expression grave. The banker in him had already calculated the financial implications of their changed circumstances, and perhaps the potential consequences of Margaret's borrowing of Parker family heirlooms. Amelia alone seemed unable to process the evening's revelations. She sat clutching her coffee cup, eyes darting between family members as if waiting for someone to announce this had all been an elaborate joke. "The university program begins in September," I told her gently. "That gives you 3 months to consider your options and prepare. The stipend would cover comfortable accommodations near campus." "I don't understand why you're doing this," she said, her voice small. "If you hate us so much, why offer anything at all?" "I told you earlier, Amelia, I don't hate any of you. I'm offering what each of you has earned through your actions over 30 years. In your case, you've shown potential for growth that your siblings haven't demonstrated. Education might help you realize that potential." Sebastian, who had been observing this exchange with evident interest, set down his cup. "Ms. Parker, you mentioned a conservation initiative for Thornfield's grounds. I'd be very interested to hear your vision, especially as it contrasts with the development proposal Charles shared." This shift in conversation seemed to physically pain Charles, who muttered something about checking on the car and strode from the room. "My mother was an accomplished botanist," I explained, warming to a subject close to my heart. The gardens at Thornfield were her life's work, particularly the western woodlands, which contained several rare species that she introduced from specimen collecting expeditions in the 1970s. I've maintained her records and continued her work quietly over the years. That explains why that section of the property has such unusual biodiversity, Sebastian noted. Our environmental survey identified at least 3 plant species there that are exceptionally rare in Britain. Exactly, I confirmed. My proposal would establish a formal conservation trust for those woodlands, with research facilities and limited public access for educational purposes. The Parker Foundation, which I'm in the process of establishing, would provide initial funding. Victoria's head snapped up. The Parker Foundation? Yes, I replied calmly. One of my first actions will be establishing a foundation focused on architectural preservation and botanical conservation. The irony that the financial resources will come from the same trust that supported the Blackwood lifestyle for 30 years is not lost on me. Mrs. Montgomery Smith cleared her throat delicately. Perhaps we should take our leave as well. It seems the family has much to discuss privately. Of course, I acknowledged. Though I would welcome a continuation of our conservation discussion at a more appropriate time, Sebastian. He nodded, a spark of genuine interest in his eyes. I'd be delighted. Perhaps next week, after the transition period has concluded? As the Montgomery Smiths made their goodbyes, with none of the social plans or future engagements that would normally conclude such a dinner, I could see Victoria mentally cataloging the social fallout that would inevitably follow this evening's revelations. Her carefully cultivated position in local society had been built entirely on her perceived status as mistress of Thornfield Manor, a status that had vanished like morning mist. The front door closed behind the departing guests, leaving only the Blackwoods and me in the drawing room that had witnessed 3 decades of their entitlement. The car for the Dower house has arrived, Mrs. Winters announced from the doorway, a hint of satisfaction in her tone. Victoria stood with difficult dignity. I'll get my coat. Charles, Amelia, are you coming to see the property? As they moved toward the entrance hall, Margaret approached me directly. This list of items to be returned, is it negotiable? Some of these pieces have been displayed in our home for years. Our friends believe they're family heirlooms. They are family heirlooms, I replied. My family's. And no, the list is non-negotiable. Every item must be returned in good condition within the specified time frame for the financial settlement to be processed. Margaret's face tightened, but she said nothing more, following her family toward the door. I remained in the drawing room alone, listening to the unfamiliar sound of Thornfield Manor emptying of Blackwoods. The grandfather clock in the hall, a Parker timepiece that had marked the hours for over 2 centuries, struck 10 with the same resonant chime that had measured out my 30 years of patience. Helena returned from making calls in the library. Victoria and Charles have gone to view the Dower house. Margaret and Jonathan have departed for their home. Amelia is upstairs, apparently packing, though mostly taking selfies and crying on the phone to friends from what security reports. I nodded, feeling a curious emptiness. The moment I had anticipated for 30 years had arrived and passed, and now the reality of what came next stretched before me. Second thoughts? Helena asked perceptively. Not about the justice of it, I clarified, but perhaps about what follows. For 30 years, every day had a clear purpose. Maintain the charade, document the Blackwoods' behavior, prepare for the eventual reckoning. Now that purpose is fulfilled. And a new one begins, Helena reminded me. The Parker Foundation, the Conservation Initiative, the restoration of Thornfield to its historical significance. Your father's vision extended beyond merely reclaiming the estate. He wanted you to rebuild what the Blackwoods had squandered. Mrs. Winters appeared with a tray bearing a single glass of my favorite cognac, a small luxury I had occasionally permitted myself in the privacy of my cottage, but never in the main house. Thought you might need this, Miss Eleanor, she said with a warmth that transcended her formal address. First night as the proper mistress of Thornfield deserves a proper toast. I accepted the glass gratefully. Will you join me, Mrs. Winters? And you, Helena. This moment belongs to all of us who kept the secret for so long. Mrs. Winters disappeared briefly, returning with 2 more glasses. We raised them in a quiet toast. To Augustus Parker, Helena said, a man of extraordinary foresight. To patience, Mrs. Winters added, the virtue that outlasts all others. To Thornfield, I concluded, returned at last to those who truly value it. The cognac warmed my throat, a fitting conclusion to an evening that had transformed 3 decades of subservience into rightful ownership. 6 months later, autumn painted Thornfield's grounds in brilliant colors as I walked the woodland path, with Sebastian. His regular visits to discuss the Conservation Trust had gradually evolved into something more personal, a connection between 2 people who shared a deep appreciation for heritage and stewardship. "The Botanical Research Center plans are approved," he informed me, ducking beneath a low-hanging branch. "Construction can begin in spring." Just in time for the new growth season, I noted with satisfaction. My mother would have been delighted to see her work continued in such a formal capacity. We paused at the small stone bench overlooking the valley, a vantage point that captured Thornfield Manor in all its historic glory. The morning sunlight caught the newly restored stonework and flashed against windows that had been professionally cleaned for the first time in decades. "Any word from the Blackwoods?" Sebastian asked carefully. I shook my head. "Victoria has settled into the dower house with remarkable adaptation. She's already reframing her reduced circumstances as a deliberate choice. Downsizing for simplicity is the phrase she uses in the village. Charles accepted the position with the Preservation Society in Scotland, primarily because it came with accommodation. Margaret and Jonathan have separated. Apparently, the revelation of her systematic theft created irreparable trust issues." "And Amelia?" A small smile touched my lips. "Surprisingly, she's thriving at university. Her social media now focuses on historical landscapes and conservation. She has a genuine eye for photography when it's directed at something beyond herself." Sebastian nodded thoughtfully. "Your father's plan was remarkably prescient, not just in reclaiming the estate, but in allowing each Blackwood to reveal their true character over time. He understood that justice delivered hastily often fails to teach its most important lessons," I replied. "The 30-year trust wasn't just about legal maneuvering. It was about ensuring that when the reckoning came, it would be both incontestable and instructive." We continued our walk, coming eventually to the cottage where I had lived. During my years as Eleanor the housekeeper, though I now occupied the master suite in Thornfield Manor, I had maintained the cottage exactly as it was, a reminder of the role I had played and the patience I had cultivated. "Will you keep it as a museum of sorts?" Sebastian asked, noting how I paused at its garden gate. "Not a museum," I corrected. "More a testament to the fact that appearances and reality often diverge. Inside that modest cottage, I maintained my education, published academic work under a pseudonym, and planned the restoration of my family's legacy, all while the Blackwoods believed me to be nothing more than their servant." Sebastian's hand found mine, a gesture that had become increasingly natural over our months of collaboration. "The invisible woman who saw everything." "Not invisible," I corrected with a smile. "Simply overlooked. There's a significant difference. 1. The Blackwoods never understood until it was too late." As we turned back toward the manor, I reflected on how completely life at Thornfield had transformed. The Parker Foundation offices now occupied what had been Charles's rarely used study. Victoria's overly formal drawing room had been restored to the comfortable literary salon my mother had originally designed. The garish renovations the Blackwoods had implemented over the years were being systematically reversed, revealing the authentic character of a house that had stood for centuries before they briefly occupied it. Mrs. Winters still presided over the kitchen, though now with a full staff of properly trained and fairly compensated professionals. She had declined my offer of retirement, insisting that seeing Thornfield proper again was all the reward she needed for her decades of loyalty. The Parker family portraits had been rehung in the grand hallway, replacing the artwork Victoria had selected primarily for its matching of her color schemes. Among them was a new addition, a dignified painting of myself, commissioned to take its place in the lineage of Parker stewards who had maintained Thornfield through generations. The trustees are arriving at 2 for the foundation meeting, Helena reminded me as we entered the main hall. The Heritage Grant applications have all been prepared for review. I nodded, hanging my walking coat on the antique hall stand that had been retrieved from storage where Victoria had relegated it, deeming it too old-fashioned for her modernized entryway. "Will you be joining us, Sebastian?" I asked. "Your conservation expertise would be valuable for several of the proposals." "I wouldn't miss it," he assured me. "The Parker Foundation is establishing itself as a significant force in preservation circles already. My own foundation is honored to collaborate." As we moved toward the library where the meeting would be held, I paused at the portrait of my father that now hung in its rightful place of honor. His eyes seemed to follow me with quiet approval. The daughter who had fulfilled his final wish through 3 decades of extraordinary patience. "Was it worth it?" Sebastian asked quietly, following my gaze to the portrait. 30 years is more than half your life." I considered the question carefully. It wasn't just about waiting for a predetermined date to claim an inheritance. It was about understanding the true value of what was being protected. By living as I did, I experienced Thornfield from every perspective, not just as its owner, but as its caretaker in the most fundamental sense. In the distance, I could hear the arrival of cars bringing the foundation trustees. Thornfield was coming alive again with purpose rather than mere possession, becoming a center for conservation, education, and preservation rather than simply a status symbol for a family that had never truly appreciated its significance. Besides, I added with a smile that held the wisdom of those 30 patient years, some forms of justice require not just firmness, but finesse. The Blackwoods spent 30 years believing they owned Thornfield, only to discover they had merely been its temporary caretakers. I spent 30 years appearing to be their servant, while actually being Thornfield's true guardian. There's a certain poetry in that resolution that an immediate confrontation could never have achieved. Sebastian's admiring gaze suggested he understood the depth of conviction that had sustained me through those decades of silent observation. From invisible servant to visible steward, a transformation 30 years in the making. Not invisible. I corrected him one final time as we moved to greet the arriving trustees. Just overlooked. The distinction matters, because in overlooking me, the Blackwoods missed seeing the very person who was documenting their unworthiness to possess what they thought was theirs. As the heavy oak doors of Thornfield Manor opened to welcome visitors, who understood and respected its heritage, I stepped forward not as Eleanor the housekeeper, but as Eleanor Parker, rightful owner and guardian of a legacy that had endured through generations, and would now, under my stewardship, continue for generations to come. The 30-year masquerade had ended, but Thornfield's true renaissance was just beginning. And this time, its mistress would be neither overlooked nor underestimated again. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload. From us,